for this movie presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand using the Go To Meeting feature as you see it here. We'll make sure any and all of your questions get answered by Dan or Michael. Find our tour page for upcoming webinars and workshops, and movies for most of our past webinars. That's tour.infotex.com. Please know that at the end of this presentation are several legal disclaimers. These disclaimers explain the links shown on your screen. And now, it's our pleasure to introduce you to our webinar moderator, the Code Curator and Special Envoy from the SEAM, Michael Harkey. Michael?
Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is 3 topics for your board of directors. We are getting a lot of feedback about these movies, probably the main takeaway being that you'd like us to do more and cover even more topics. More on that a bit later. Again, today's webinar is 3 topics, a webinar about 3 things you may want to bring to your board's attention in the next 6 months or so. I mentioned that I didn't think that was a great title, but it was too late to officially change it. Dan pushed back that our clients are superheroes, though I don't deny that information security officers in this day and age are cybersecurity superheroes. It was just too late. However, we know you are very busy, and for that reason, we like to do these webinars in a webinar, or a movie within a movie is what we like to call them. What you are watching now is the full webinar, meant for information security officers, where we will cover how to provide board awareness training. We will then break this out into a short movie called Vulnerability Management for the board that can be presented to your board of directors. So today you'll get a little behind the scenes action as we make live cuts to form that movie. More on that later. What I'd like to do real quick is show where to find our movies, recorded webinars, also future events, webinars, talks, and workshops. It can be found right here on our tour page. This is where we announce upcoming webinars and engagements. Next month, we will be talking about the board's role in incident response, which, by the way, is one of the topics we'll be touching on today. The rest of the page is essentially recorded webinars and movies that we have deemed useful enough to archive for your convenience. Everything from testing your SEAM to out-of-wallet questions, which is set up a lot like today's webinar, and that there is a movie for the information security team to show you how to integrate the training, and movies that can be shown on their own to your employees. Technology planning is another one I'd like to point out, as we update it every year after the Indiana Bankers Cybersecurity Conference, which is on October 1st and 2nd of this year. So we'll have that webinar on October 15th where we leverage what we learned. Point being that there is a wealth of information for our clients, or even if you're not a client. If you are a client, please keep in mind that you also have full access to our boilerplate library at no additional cost. Again, the movies recorded from this webinar, the full webinar, and the 25-minute board awareness training movie will be available later this month. We will announce it on our mailing list and our tour page. Dan gets many requests for the PowerPoints that he uses in these webinars, and just know we'll be happy to provide that as a courtesy to our clients. And with that, I have the distinct privilege to introduce to you the awareness guru from Indiana, the only man with a hand cooler than Luke, and can sometimes be found upside down and inside out, especially when preparing a webinar within a webinar, Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thank you very much, Michael. I especially like the inside out part of that introduction because that's kind of how I feel this morning. So I'd like to, of course, start with my monthly shout out. And actually this month's shout out goes to the people who could not make today's webinar, even though they signed up for today's webinar that was supposed to be delivered in June. I apologize for that. We had to postpone that webinar until today. And it was done at a little bit of a last moment. I think it was like 5 days in advance or something. And so I know we got on your calendar. I hope you saw the cancellation notice. But suffice it to say, we're busier than we normally are, and we had to move this webinar back due to client needs and that sort of thing. Today's agenda is interesting because I want to talk about 3 topics that you should be sitting down with your board over. Really, we're going to dive into vulnerability management in a lot of detail, but there's two other topics that are a little less difficult. Like Mike said, one of the topics we're going to be diving down and drilling down into details in our August webinar. But before I go too much further, let me start off by acknowledging that a bit more than half of our clients really would not want to be called Joe, and that's why we developed Jane ISO. And just so you know, we heavily support the Banking on Women conference that's coming up at the Indiana Bankers Association in November, not only because more than half of our clients are females, but also because we just think it's a good thing to do. It's a great conference. My wife Stacy goes to it, and she really likes that conference. And so I guess this is a second shout out to the Indiana Bankers. So what we're really wanting to do is kind of talk about the topics that aren't on your normal plate. These three topics that I'm bringing up today are not the topics that you should be presenting to your board of directors on a programmatic annual basis. If you look at your annual information security report to the board, really those are the topics that I believe you should be bringing up on a regular basis. You will be talking to your board about your risk assessment results, as an example, more than once. And what I'm really wanting to talk about today are, topics that information security officers need to discuss with their board because they're timely in 2019. They might not necessarily be something that's part of your annual presentation to the board. What we've learned over the years is that establishing a security culture is probably the most important thing that you can do as an information security officer. And thus, going in and meeting with the board on, we feel, a monthly basis, and bringing into that meeting, bits and pieces of what you summarize for them in your annual report to the board is all a part of establishing that security culture by putting the board on board, so to speak. This webinar is not really that. Instead, this webinar is for the information security officers who already have the board on board, who find their board is so engaged that they're becoming bored with the annual report to the board to really kill the play on words there. And what's happened over the last 6 to 7 months is through interaction with various clients and audits and conferences that we go to, I've begun to recognize that there's 3 topics not in your annual report to the board that the board should understand. First, there's the need for a more robust risk appetite statement. We all should already have a risk appetite statement that arose out of our cybersecurity assessment tool response. You might not call that a risk appetite statement, but if you remember, the third step of the 5-step program was to have the board weigh in on where they wanted you to be from an inherent risk perspective, as well as where they wanted you to be from a residual risk. So the inherent risk is most smaller banks are at, they don't want to go above intermediate inherent risk, and from a maturity level, from the residual risk perspective, most banks that we work with at least are wanting to be at either baseline or evolving. And that actually is a risk appetite statement. Meanwhile, we would like to shore that up and to make that apply to more than just cybersecurity. Another topic that a lot of information security officers are finding apparently necessary to go over with the board is their role in incident response. And hopefully the board really is the only part of the bank left that has not been involved in some sort of exercise teaching the role that we all play when there's an incident. So we definitely can get a lot of value out of teaching the board what their role is going to be. And let's face it, if we're in the middle of an incident where we have to notify our customers, we don't want to regret not helping the board understand what their role is until we're all in a panic and in a bad mood and worried about our jobs or whatever, right? And so let's get out in front of that and talk to the board about their role in incident response prior to that inevitable, incident. Finally, most of us are still struggling with the notion of patch management. And from a metaphorical perspective, we've decided that what needs to happen is we need to turn patch management into a more meaningful and safe experience, which we're now calling vulnerability management. And fortunately, the rest of the industry seems to agree with us, and everybody's talking about vulnerability management now. And obviously, we all know it's a lot easier said than done. And I'm a firm believer, again, that if we get the board on board, it'll be easier for us to accomplish the job of turning patch management into vulnerability management. And so now I guess we need to start the movie. And Michael, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. We have pre-recorded the movie so you can see exactly what will be shown to your board if you choose to show the movie. So hope you have some popcorn, and let's begin.
And thank you for joining Infotex for this movie presentation. Find our tour page for upcoming webinars and workshops, and movies for most of our past webinars. That's tour.infotex.com. Please know that at the end of this presentation are several legal disclaimers. These disclaimers explain the links shown on your screen. And now it's our pleasure to introduce you to our webinar moderator, the code curator and special envoy from the SEAM, Michael Hardkey. Michael?
Hi, my name is Michael Harkey, and I'm the moderator of today's presentation, Vulnerability Management for the Board of Directors. This is a movie that Infotex has produced in hopes to help Board of Directors understand what an uphill battle network engineers and information security officers face in small community-based banks when it comes to turning our patch management program into a vulnerability management program. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. He has 13 letters after his name. He's the managing partner for Infotex. He speaks regularly to boards of directors as well as management team members and of course information security officers and small community-based banks. With that, I will turn control over to the one and only Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thank you very much, Michael. This is what I look like a lot, providing basic information security education to users and to customers and of course board members. And I also have the honor to speak on a regular basis to these two characters here. We call this guy here Joe ISO, and this person here is Jane ISO. And I know they're our clients, but we believe they're superheroes. And as superheroes, they need your help. You see, they have always struggled in the battle against a super cyber villain, one that we used to call patch management. And now, thanks to your help, we're going to win this battle against the super bad guys. Because if you can understand what we're trying to do, that understanding and empathy might just be what we need to tackle the problem. And while it is going to cost a little bit of money, and we'll talk about that when we get to this third thing here, which, by the way, PM stands for patch management and VM stands for vulnerability management. Awareness is what we really feel is a big part of the battle. And so by your attending this webinar, you're going to help us attack this problem and turn this, continual lemon into lemonade. So what we'd like to do first is start off with a little review and then dive into the history of patch management and then describe what needs to happen in order for us to change patch management into vulnerability management. And so imagine the last time you bought a new car, right? And what was nice about buying the car new is that the manufacturer of that car would keep track of whenever there was a problem with the car, and they would issue a recall, right? And then you'd take your car into the dealership, the dealer would fix whatever problem happened to be with the car, and you'd get your car back and it would be like new. Well, that's kind of what patch management is like. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, software publishers don't have to release software that is completely, working when it's first released. If software publishers were in the manufacturing industry, they would quickly go out of business and they wouldn't be in the manufacturing industry anymore. And the reason why is because not only do they get to release their software with all kinds of security vulnerabilities and all kinds of problems in it, but they require us to fix those problems, not the dealership. And they can even announce a sunset date, meaning the day that they're no longer going to fix the problems. And we have all agreed to all of that when we hit the accept button on the license agreement. The whole process is established to help software publishers mitigate the legal risk that they face because they're releasing software with security problems in it. And guess what? If you're a non-technical board member, I bet you've heard of the very technical term patch management. And that's probably because, like a lot of other smaller banks, patch management is the problem that's causing the symptoms that you see when you see the audit reports. So the findings that you're seeing in your audit reports are very often symptoms of a patch management process that is just simply not working. And we need to stop this, right? We can't keep finding vulnerabilities in our audits. And you want to know why? Because if the auditors can find the vulnerabilities, guess what? So can the bad guys. Now, technical people might bristle a little bit at me describing patch management as being like recall on your new auto, because you, not the dealership, gets to fix the issue. And when I say you, really, it's the technical team, right? And they spend a huge amount of time fixing patch, issues that come with the software that we rely on in order to do our jobs. And just so you know, it's not as easy as just replacing a part on a car. Very often, patches will blow up other processes. The software publishers are different companies. And so Microsoft might release a patch that blows up something in the Adobe realm, or Adobe might release a patch that blows up something in the Oracle, applications or whatever. But making things worse, imagine the problem here being so great that every month you have to haul your car into the dealership to get a new problem fixed. That's what we're dealing with in patch management. We actually now have a phrase called Patch Tuesday, which is the day of the month. It's the second Tuesday of every month where Microsoft releases all the fixes to their buggy software. And if you have seen our movies and our webinars about the canary in the coal mine, suffice it to say, this is a sick bird. This patch management problem is something we've got to fix because it's the last bastion of vulnerabilities left in our bank's network. And it's really the only place that the bad guys, I shouldn't say the only, of course, they can still call up our employees and ask for account balances and that sort of thing. But when it comes to a huge breach blowing everything up, it's usually the unpatched vulnerability that starts the whole process falling apart. What I'd like to do next really is to dive into the history. I've kind of learned that maybe one way to help you understand where we are now is to help you kind of learn how we got here, right? In the late 1990s, just so you know, Microsoft didn't even have a network application or a network operating system until about 1996 when they came out with Windows NT. But it was before the turn of the century that Microsoft finally fessed up and said, yes, we're releasing software that has all kinds of security bugs in them. And because of that, in the early 2000s, we evolved to what we now call Patch Tuesday, where once a month, Microsoft patches its operating system. And shortly after that, third-party applications, what we call third-party applications, started producing patches for their systems as well. And most of the third-party applications are either made by Adobe or Oracle, but suffice it to say, if there's an application out there that has a security bug, the publisher of that application will now release a patch for it in order to mitigate their own legal risk. But really, until 2007, we as an information security consultancy had an uphill battle just helping banks realize that we need to get our arms around this problem. We need to start getting out in front of this problem, because there's real bad guys out there that are going to exploit these vulnerabilities if we're not careful. But in 2007, an application named Zeus came onto the marketplace, so to speak, really the dark marketplace, the black market. The dark web is what we all call it now. And in 2007, you were able to, download at no cost an application called Zeus. What I always find interesting is, number one, though the application's in English, if you need any help, you're going to have to learn Russian, because Zeus was published by the Russian Business Network, which was a syndicate in Russia at the time. I don't know if they're still around. But I also found it interesting that they copyright their software. I don't think they use the American court system to enforce their copyright. I suspect they probably use weapons to enforce their copyright. But suffice it to say, this scared the heck out of the industry, because what Zeus was meant to do, at least initially, was help people who weren't really technical attack American banks. Zeus comes with all kinds of modules, or it came with all kinds of modules. One module was meant to attack mobile banking. Another module had all of the IP addresses of American banks in it. Another module could allow you to design your own virus so that you can stay under the radar of antivirus applications. And so once Zeus arrived, it caused enough concern to where banks started focusing in on what we now call patch management. And really, in other words, another way to put that is the rest is history. That's really when we started this process that we're trying to finish now. And I really feel like it's important for you to understand that even though we have this process in place to address these known vulnerabilities, there are far more unknown vulnerabilities than there are now. That, for every vulnerability, there's probably 1,000 unknown vulnerabilities. And so, that's one thing that, we still have to face, is even if we are fully patched, there still may be vulnerabilities in our system. Meanwhile, anymore, if somebody clicks on the link, that brings malware into your system, or say they open an attachment that they shouldn't have opened, those applications, the attachment that has the malware in it, that malware actually leverages the vulnerabilities that should have been patched on your network before the malware ended up on that network. And so, if we don't have fully patched systems, we are really exposed to a lot of risk. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of applications out there now, like Zeus, that are free on the dark web, and they're meant to discover and exploit vulnerabilities that people may still have in their systems, even after they've gone through a huge amount of effort to patch those systems. This metric right here is getting a little bit old, but I love it because it helps make my point, which is in 2017, 85% of the breaches that were reported were breaches that started from malware exploiting vulnerabilities where patches were already available. In other words, forget the unknown vulnerabilities. We're not fixing the known vulnerabilities, and that's causing breaches on our networks. Now, this is all a lot easier said than done. Very, very a lot easier said than done. And I mean, if you think about it, these were the critical patches that were released in 2015. And I apologize for the age of the metric, but that was the last time we counted this. And let's just say that on average, and by the way, I don't know how long it takes to patch devices. That all depends on the patch. It all depends on the device. It all depends on the person doing the patching. It all depends on everything else going on. It probably takes less time if there's only one patch released on, Patch Tuesday than if there's 1,000 released the same day. But let's just say that it takes 10 minutes on average to apply a security patch to a desktop. Then in 2015 alone, Microsoft required us to spend 1,500 minutes patching desktops. Do you want to know what 1,500 minutes is? That's 25 hours. That's like 3 days spent just patching the security patches for Microsoft. And by the way, that's only on the desktop. All right. And that doesn't include the other 6,000 patches that weren't security patches. I mean, that's outrageous. 3 days. Now let's, say I'm wrong about that. Let's say it only takes 3 minutes. Well, that's 1 day. That's 1 day of somebody's life just dedicated to the top priority patches in 2015. And I also want to stress, this doesn't include servers. We're just talking about desktops here. We draw these kind of drawings on a regular basis. Now, we actually call this a cyber kill chain. I feel like from a non-technical perspective, it would be better to call it an anatomy of an attack. This attack vector happens to be a corporate account takeover. You might be familiar with this from other board awareness training. This is the attack vector that costs banks the most amount of money. And I want to point out that in every single one of the cyber kill chains I've drawn in the last 3 or 4 years, these 2 words are in there: exploit vulnerability. The breach cannot occur usually if we don't exploit vulnerabilities on your system. And so we want to turn patch management into vulnerability management. And in order to do that, we want the board to understand what vulnerability management equals. And so to us, patch management is like this. We find the patches. Usually we're supposed to test the patches, but most smaller community-based banks, what they do is they wait. Maybe they apply the patch on a couple endpoints and wait to see if it blows anything up. And if everything looks good, then they apply the patch across the enterprise, and then we start all over, find the patches, wait to make sure they don't blow anything up, apply the patch across the enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what we'd like to do is we'd like to move to a process that begins with awareness training, and that's really why you are here watching this movie, and I really appreciate the fact that you're willing to spend this time. But then we want to prioritize our patches. We want to work on those 150 critical patches that Microsoft released first, and then we can get to the other 6,000 patches that aren't so critical. And then beyond that, the most important part, and by the way, this is the part that's going to cost a little bit of money, we want to test before the auditors come in to make sure that our patch management system worked, that we fully patched every asset on our system, that we followed the priorities that we had established when we established those priorities. And this patch management process that we've been using since 2007 isn't working. We're still ending up with audit findings that when you trace them back to what caused this audit finding, about 85% of the time, it's poor patch management. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to change this process into a vulnerability management process that starts with a board level policy. Now, you may have already been looking at a policy to approve. Usually it's just a paragraph that you're going to insert into your information security program if you're FDIC bank, or your IT governance program, or your risk management policy, whatever top level policy you have that addresses these kind of high level policy issues without having to have a standalone policy, you're going to be approving in the next couple weeks or so. And that policy really is going to require that we continue to find the broken applications on our network, but then we prioritize what we're going to do about those patches during the waiting period. We're still going to test to make sure they don't blow anything up, that sort of thing. But we're also going to focus in on the critical patches first, the patches that the publisher has identified as being a security patch, meaning that if we don't apply that patch, we have risk. And the patches that, are fixing, nuisances or bugs or feature patches or whatever, we're going to put them lower priority than the security patches. From there, then, of course, we're going to apply the patch, but then the final and most important part probably of this process is we're going to then test to make sure that we did get the patches on all of the assets. What we're going to do is we're going to scan our network using the same tools that the auditors, and as importantly, the same tools that our bad guys are using to find vulnerabilities on the network. And this is where the money comes in, by the way. And it's not that much money. And by the way, Infotex doesn't sell any of this stuff. So I'm hoping you're not thinking that this is a sales pitch, but you might have already heard the terms Nessus or Qualys, which are the two vulnerability scanning applications that most smaller community-based banks are using nowadays to test to make sure that we did get all of the systems patched. And by the way, it's a lot easier said than done. I mean, finding, we got 100 assets and the patch is made on all but 3 of those assets. For some reason, getting the patches back on those 3 assets is a lot easier said than done. And it's usually because maybe it's a laptop that was gone for somebody's vacation while the patch was applied, or maybe somebody shut off their workstation and so we couldn't apply the patch on it, or maybe a workstation's in repair or whatever. But suffice it to say, we need to establish that policy. We need to create a method for prioritizing the patches. We need to create a method for testing. But then most importantly, once we've got the list of where we did not complete the job, we want to follow up and make sure we do dot the I and cross the T. Again, it's a lot easier said than done. If you're a bank that's originally setting up their patch, their vulnerability management system, another important aspect of the policy that we're encouraging our smaller community-based banks to do is to be sure that the person who tests the patches is not necessarily the same person who's in charge of applying the patches. That segregation solves a lot of issues, not just operational. And so we really encourage our banks to work towards that. A lot easier said than done, especially in the smaller community-based banks where you have the resources in terms of team members to be able to pull that off. One last thing I really want to make sure you understand before we move into describing what's actually going to change here. But we're still not going to have 0 findings in our vulnerability assessments, all right? And so I want to make sure I set that expectation correctly. What we should have is 0 high-risk findings, 0 critical risk findings, maybe even 0 moderate risk findings. But what we're learning is that if we have to chase around those 6,000 low-risk patches, it makes us harder to ensure that we're fixing all of the high-risk patches. And so we're really hoping that the application providers are doing a good job on their risk assessments, because we're using their declaration as to how important the patch is to prioritize those patches. Now, what's going to change is that, we're going to still have a never-ending process. It's still going to be a cycle. It's still going to be something that we constantly are chasing. But instead of being a sprint that we lose, we're going to get into a marathon, right? We're going to continually test. We're going to continually work to improve our methodologies. We're going to try to fine-tune our system so that we don't have to deal with the same false positive more than once. We're going to make sure that instead of everything based, the risk-based system delivers a process where the success is measured by the overall risk in your network rather than how many patches we don't have applied. And so I want to end by really, encouraging you to go out and read this article that we have on our blog. If you go to my.infotex.com/patches, it's written for non-technical people. It pretty much summarizes everything I've said today. And one last thing, I want to also stress to you that your information security officer, Joe or Jane ISO, are very, very happy that you spent 25 minutes or so it's going to take to get through this movie, because by your dedicating this time to learning what vulnerability management is, you're helping everybody in the process with their job, and we feel that job is very, very important. Just one more, thing by way of summary. The intended use of the movie that you just watched is to play it directly to your board. Like Mike alluded to earlier, a lot of our clients are asking for the original PowerPoint presentation. I haven't asked them why, but I'm assuming maybe you want to take and customize this presentation and deliver it in person to your board. And that's even better than playing a movie by me. Okay, and so we're more than happy to provide that to our clients. If you're not a client, you're interested in that, please reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to provide that to you as well, but we want to make sure you understand the transfer of copyright agreement. Our clients see that all the time, but I want to make sure prospects or just people that are interested in banking understand that. But then finally, I also want to encourage you to not only play that movie for your board, but also to provide that kind of awareness training to your management team. Awareness is 9/11 instead of battle, in my opinion. We were far more secure today after 9/11 than we were the day before. And I find it's because of the fact that we had awareness in place. And so I want to, finish the webinar by touching back on the other two topics that we feel you might want to go over with your board of directors. I already talked about the cybersecurity assessment tool, helping us create a cybersecurity risk appetite statement. Most of the banks we work with are saying that, hey, if we're going to bring in a new product, service, or application that puts us in an inherent risk perspective that's riskier than intermediate, which is the first step in the cybersecurity assessment tool, then the board should be notified. And likewise, the board wants to be notified when we're not at baseline or when we're not at evolving or whatever maturity target maturity level we've established. That's actually a risk appetite statement. But I also want to talk a little bit about the notion that you can use your adoption philosophy in a risk appetite statement. And so, most banks are now starting to become self-aware in terms of what their adoption philosophy is. When we go in to audit a bank, a lot of times banks will describe themselves as late majority adopters of technology, unless it's security technology, and then maybe they're an early adopter, that sort of thing. And so we're just suggesting that maybe the board weigh in on that and say that, hey, anytime we're adopting a technology as an early adopter or even as an early majority adopter, before the first 50% of the market adopts the technology, the board wants to be notified. Likewise, we also have a really good topic that you might want to bring up with your, board of directors from a risk appetite perspective. And maybe you do, maybe you don't formalize it. But every time we engage with a new bank as an audit engagement, we always need to know, are you going to require your team to address every one of these really minor, low risk, non-technical findings that we're, coming across? Because boy, that's going to stink, because it's going to take you away from your ability to be able to address the moderate and high risk findings. And so we, strongly encourage you to have a conversation with your board. If you want to formalize it into a risk appetite statement, we feel that gives you cover with other auditors and examiners. But the board should really be telling you, your information security officer, that whether or not low risk non-technical audit findings are addressed will be at the discretion of the information security officer, not the auditor. And the language for that, for the risk appetite statements, is in this article here, and it'll help you kind of look at the, if you read that, you'll see exactly what we mean, because we're suggesting you actually take that and put it into your risk management policy, your information security program, wherever it is that you define how the bank is going to manage technology risk. We do intend to produce a short 15-minute movie on risk appetite statements. We're not going to make it as part of a movie within a movie like we will next month with the incident response role. But for now, just focus in on that article. I feel like you'll totally understand where we're heading with that. If you need that movie to help your board understand where we're heading, I'm hoping that movie will be available when we give our August webinar. Meanwhile, the board of directors does play a very important role in incident response. Not only should they be notified in real time, but we're finding that without advanced training, you end up spending a lot of time helping the board understand the process that's going to unfold as you're trying to unfold it. And keep in mind that if you're doing that during an incident, you could be doing it in the context of everybody being in a panic, or at least not in a very good mood, because we just made a big mistake and now we've got to notify our customers of that mistake, right? And beware, we are going to try to make the case in our webinar here, in our movie within our movie, that at least one of your board members should sit through your tabletop testing exercise. I know that'll be scary, but we're finding there's a lot of aha moments that come out of a good tabletop test. And why not have the board gain from that awareness as well? Awareness is truly 9/11 to the battle. And the more aware our board is of what's going to happen when we make that terrible mistake, the easier it is going to be for us to turn that potential lemon into lemonade. And meanwhile, it turns out that the board roles and information, the board's role in incident response is so important and so kind of detailed that it warrants its own webinar. And so I'm hoping you all make it back in August to see the webinar. It's going to be a movie within a movie webinar just like this, where we talk to you about why the board should be involved in incident response, why we should get the board into our tabletop testing, at least one board member. And then, of course, we'll create a movie for your board in that regard. Okay, well, it looks to me like we're ready to hand this over to you then. And
again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Dan, as always. And everybody have a great day.
It's always an honor.
Thanks, Dan.
When you view an InfoText webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoText presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoText webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoText reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the webpage listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.